As a rebreather diver, we have rules that we follow, just like we follow in cave diving rules. There's rules for rebreather diving. So let's talk about what rules do we follow, starting with avoid complacency.
Well, that is a really big one. With a rebreather, you're going to see that most manufacturers will put a scary stamp on it and put it in their manual that this device will kill you or it's trying to kill you. What are we talking about? You have to be mindful of a rebreather because I already talked about in how it works that it could build up carbon dioxide. And you know, if you breathe in and out carbon dioxide, you're probably going to die after some certain point. But don't let that scare you. It's very easy to not be complacent. We're going to go through a checklist when we assemble it. We're going to go through tests before we dive it. We're going to go through a pre-jump little mini checklist before we get in the water. During the dive, we're going to go underwater. We're going to make sure there's no bubbles. And then we're always going to monitor our partial pressure. And guess what? Anything that's going wrong at any part of the dive, we thumb it. This is how complicated it is. You bail off the rebreather. You put a regulator in your mouth that's sitting right here, an open circuit regulator, and you end the dive. You can't be complacent, but it's not hard to make sure we do all those things.
Yeah, and I think that's this is one of the skills that most of the divers we look up to are like religious about. It's always interesting when we go diving with people like Ed, for example, who has 12,000 cave dives, that he's following a checklist. A checklist is the number one thing that most divers are complacent about. They assemble their unit 10 times and they're like, oh, I got it. I don't have to follow a checklist anymore. Whereas you see people who have been amazing divers for decades following a checklist. Pilots follow checklists, so follow your checklist. This is why a checklist is included in the manual and also shipped with every unit. So don't be complacent. Number two, avoiding distractions. So I'll talk a little bit about this one because I think that there's a social aspect to diving that we enjoy. When we go on a dive boat, we love it. We follow our checklist. We assemble it. We weren't complacent. But then as you're getting ready to jump in the water, you're distracted. You're talking to somebody. They're asking you about the dive talk. Oh, you watch dive talk too? Oh, cool. So you're talking or whatever, and you are distracted. And that makes you jump in the water without opening your O2, without connecting your dill. Like something will happen on that pre-dive checklist that you mentioned about, on that pre-jump checklist, that because you were distracted, you got complacent in that second. And even though you follow this checklist, you can run into issues. So avoid distractions before you dive and while you're diving.
And it's kind of a known thing with rebreather divers. They'll all give each other a minute. Like, wait, just give me a minute. You're sort of checking everything right before you're sitting on that dive boat bench, and you're checking your unit. We'll go through all the checklists and the assembly and all of that. Of course, we're going through all of that. So yeah, it's sort of a respect thing that you do, and you really don't touch somebody else's rebreather. People set it up in a particular way, and they don't want people touching it because they may not know what they're doing, and it could affect the way the rebreather's performing.
Yeah, and if you're taking this class, you're most likely coming from a recreational background. You were an open water diver and you're now moving into rebreathers, becoming a technical diver in the process. And one of the things that technical divers, have to follow is being disciplined, right? Sticking to a plan. There's one thing when you're a recreational diver and you jump in and your gas planning is be back on the boat with 500 PSI. That's the whole dive plan. The gas plan is go down, be back on the boat with 500, right? We don't do that, right? We're disciplined. You want to talk about that?
Well, we're going to really do dive planning. Now, what are we talking about? If the rebreather is functioning, it's awesome. We already told you got about 2.5 hours. The skills we're going to teach you in this class are really a lot of emergency skills. What if this happens? Do you have enough gas to get yourself to the surface? Because you may not be able to go directly to the surface anymore. We're going beyond the no decompression dive limit. We will have to stop and do what is known as a deco stop. Off gas slow enough to where the bubbles in your body won't cause you to have the bends when you get to the surface. We have to be disciplined. So we're going to plan, and we're going to show you how to plan. How much gas do I need if this rebreather fails for any reason whatsoever underwater, and I have to bail off of it and go back to my open circuit to get myself safely back up to the surface? The assembly of it has to be disciplined. You got to make sure it's working. You got to make sure there's no bubbles, water getting into the system. These things are very important to make sure this machine that some people say is trying to kill you if you don't do it properly,
Right.
has to be assembled properly, and we got to have enough gas to get back to the surface. That's really the discipline that we're talking about.
Of course. And the other rule of CCR diving is to be a thinking diver. And this is one of those things where understanding the difference between being on a rebreather versus bailing out plays a big part. Like, I'll give you an example. Sometimes you will plan a dive, and like we know that with the Dive Talk Go, you should stick to 2.5 hours of scrub time, or what we also call it stack timer. So we have a 2.5 hour stack timer. So what happens is you go pretty deep. Let's say you go to 130 feet. There's a wreck sitting at 130 feet, 40 meters, and you want to explore for like an hour. And then you're just keeping an eye on that time to surface, and you're like, okay, I'm within the 2.5 hour mark. The problem is if you bail out, you will notice if you're already in deco, your deco will skyrocket, right? It always happens. If you bail out, and you will practice this during your practical class, you will see that you have like time to surface 12 minutes, and then you bail out. Your instructor will be like, okay, your rebreather is dead. You have to bail out. And you will see now the time to surface is 28 or whatever. It will jump because the gas you're bailing out to, you cannot control the partial pressure of that the way you can control it with a rebreather. So you have to be a thinking diver.
You absolutely do. And you're going to have the following information, and you're going to learn how to use this in your practical class. Gus mentioned it. You're going to have the same information on your shearwater petrel that you're going to have to learn what it means for this discipline. Number one, you're going to have 3 numbers in the middle. That's the partial pressure. We have 3 cells, right? We want redundancy. We want to make sure all 3 cells are pretty close to each other. We'll talk about what happens if they're not. And that's the partial pressure. You also have your depth, your time, your surface interval. You have on the bottom left, typically, this is where most people put it, your closed circuit gas. What gas is your bailout gas? And you can have both oxygen and helium. Those are the 2 gases you may be using. Then you have your no decompression limit, just like you have on any recreational dive. And the final number Gus mentioned is, here's your total time to surface. At any point in the dive on the bottom right, I can read my total time to the surface. This is how long, if I bail out, it's going to take me to get to the surface. Now, you better have enough gas to make sure you can get to the surface with that total time to surface.
Yeah, and part of being a thinking diver is also understanding that you will most likely have a buddy. And if you have to bail out and your buddy needs gas because you guys lost track of time and now he needs gas too, do you have enough gas to share air with your buddy and you make it to the surface too? And I know sometimes, I don't know if you felt this way, but in some classes that we've taken, we go through this like Armageddon situations. Like, you remember in cave DPV where we're like the deepest point of the cave, the furthest time away from the surface, and now both of your rebreather fails, both your DPVs fail. Like, those are the scenarios we plan for because you need to be prepared for the worst.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to do over and over again in this class. You're going to be practicing a lot of emergency skills. One thing I'll conclude this with, you know what was amazing on my first rebreather dive after the class? The class is finally over and you get to go on your first class. Nothing. It's so peaceful and quiet. All these skills, all these emergencies, all this learning. And the whole time on the real dive is all I was doing is breathing in and out with no sound, no bubbles.
Hugging your
Every
unit.
minute looking at my dive computer. Yep, I'm at a 1.2. And it was completely peaceful and quiet.
Yeah.
That's probably what's going to happen 99.999% of the time.
Yeah. And I will go ahead and before we move to the next one, I want to, I mean, I don't know if this requires an apology, but if it did, I'm going to apologize on behalf of your practical instructor, because one of the things they'll do is make you do the same skills over and over and over again. So if you get frustrated because you're like, I already show you that I know how to shut down my O2 or bail out or whatever, why are you asking me to do it again? Depending on the instructor that you had in open water, there are some skills in open water that you do once and you get a fist bump and you never do again. In rebreather, I cannot imagine one skill that you will only do once. You're going to do it multiple times. So if you're going to be mad about that, just be mad at me. Okay? Don't be mad at your instructor. They're just doing their job.
Be mad at him.
Yeah, it's fine. Be mad at me. I'll be the bad guy. Okay. If there's one rule that we follow when it comes to rebreather diving, if there's an equivalent of that rule in open circuit diving, which is never hold your breath, in rebreather diving is always know your PO2. Why is that important? Why is that rule number one?
Rule number one, always know your PO2. Rule number two, always know your PO2. It may be the rule that you're going to hear over and over again in rebreather diving. Why? The partial pressure of your oxygen is going to control your entire dive. It's going to control how long you can stay under. It's going to control what your no decompression limit is. It's going to control all the emergency skills. Let me explain a little bit further. If the partial pressure of your oxygen is too low, you could become hypoxic. Hypoxic means you don't have enough oxygen to maintain consciousness. Now, you know, if you lose consciousness underwater, you're probably going to die. The second thing that you may have happen is your partial pressure is too high. You're hyperoxic. Guess what? Your body doesn't care about the percent of oxygen it breathes. It only cares about the partial pressure of oxygen. And if it's too high, and we typically don't want it to be above a 1.6, you could convulse. You could convulse underwater.
And die.
And then again die.
Yeah.
And also you need to know your partial pressure, because we have what are known as the CNS oxygen toxicity limits. There are basically two we're going to talk about in this course. One is a single dive limit. At whatever partial pressure you are diving at, you can only be at that partial pressure for a certain amount of time before it can start having long-term effects on your pulmonary system. So that's very important. And then throughout a day, you can only be, within a 24-hour period, you can only be on that partial pressure during a 24-hour period for a certain amount of time. That can also start to have long-term effects on your pulmonary system, your lungs. So it's really important to always know your partial pressure. Remember this, you planned your entire dive, and your bailout gas that's going to get you to the surface, if this unit was to fail, based upon a partial pressure that you promised yourself and your dive buddy that you were going to maintain. So if you don't maintain that partial pressure that you planned your bailout gas around, you may or may not have enough bailout gas to get out of the dive if your unit was to fail. You got to know your partial pressure. It drives everything we're going to talk about in this class.
And I think this one is also connected to the previous one, be a thinking diver. This is all part of being a thinking diver as well. But the importance of it, and as Woody mentioned, hypoxia and hyperoxia is, to me, a bigger threat when it comes to rebreather diving, because you're taking 100% oxygen past 20 feet. Past 20 feet, 100% oxygen goes over that 1.6. And so if you don't pay attention to it and you keep adding oxygen, or you keep the flow going and you're doing nothing or whatever, that's going to start creeping up. It's going to go past 1.6, past 2. It keeps going. Now, I don't want you to think, because I know you're watching this and you're like, oh, should I be afraid for my life? It's not that if you momentarily see 1.6 in your computer, you're going to immediately start convulsing. Woody and I have seen pretty high numbers for a second, right? You add oxygen, you see it bounce up, and then as you breathe it a couple times, it will readjust back down. So don't be afraid that if you see a high number, immediately start hammering dill because, oh, it's too high. Like, it's okay. You just want to be aware of it. If you see a high number, but you're paying attention, you know you're adding, it's going to go high and then it's going to come low, then you're paying attention to it. You're not breaking the rule. What we don't want is for you to do like a 30-minute dive without looking at your computer. That's not right, right? Always know your PO2. And I think you mentioned, one of the things that you mentioned about understanding the system and sticking to your dive, and you told your body you were gonna do something. The other thing is, another rule that we follow is do not be cheap. And there's a few situations where divers tend to be cheap, and what we mean by that is they say, okay, we're going to, let's say, 160 feet. Our unit is rated to 200. We're going to 160 feet. Let's just bring nitrox because that's all I have. Or what I have is air. That's all I have. You know that as you go that deep, you're at risk of narcosis. You're at risk of being unable to be a thinking diver. So don't be cheap. Get the right training and the right gas for your dive, right? So you can follow a plan. The same thing with the scrubber. We talked about the fact that it's rated for 2.5 hours. Now, again, that rating is based on heavy work of breathing at depth in cold water. Like, we wanted to stress the unit and be able to certify that even if you are in a really tough condition, this unit will go for 2.5 hours. So you can say, look, if I'm going to just be chilling in Cozumel, nice warm water, not breathing hard, this unit can go for like 5 hours. I can probably do Don't be cheap. SORP is not that expensive. Go for the rating on the unit. Stick to the safety standards that are shipping with the unit. And just don't be cheap.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, it's perfectly well said. That includes maintenance. We're going to have a maintenance section in the course. You've got to maintain the unit. You've got to make sure it's properly cleaned. You've got to make sure all the O-rings are properly lubricated. You got to make sure that everything is functioning. You got to make sure that it's serviced at least annually. We can do that for you. You can learn how to do it yourself, but there are certain things that you just cannot be cheap on. And this life-saving gear, that's not an area to be cheap. You got to maintain it. You got to take care of it per the standards, per our manual, per the instruction we're going to give you. And just don't be cheap when it comes to rebreather diving. It's
Right.
your life.
These units are also not made to sit at a mantle as a display. They're beautiful, right? Don't get me wrong. I love the way the Go looks, right? Especially that one with the orange logo on it.
Yeah, I don't
Looks
know how
beautiful.
that accidentally got on there.
But there is no shortcut to proficiency. There is no shortcut to, being natural in the water. You have to put the hours in. So make the rebreather your primary diving equipment.
Yeah, and let's just talk about that for a second. Don't get frustrated. I've told students this for a long time. You're going to start off on a rebreather class all over again. Guess what? You know how you learned about your breathing really is the primary thing that controls your buoyancy? Not anymore. Why? We just explained a rebreather. The volume of air is not going to change. It's actually just getting stored in counterlungs. So you're going to exhale and think, oh, good, that's going to make me go down a little. No, it's not, because you didn't exhale that into the water column. So give it a minute, a couple of days. That's why you start off in a pool. Your buoyancy control on a rebreather is going to take a minute. You're going to go through this uphill climb like on a mountain. Why did I do this? This is so much harder.
Wasted
and then
all
all of a
this
sudden, you're going to be like, Gus
Greatest
and
thing
Woody,
ever.
I do not want to ever dive again without my rebreather on, because it becomes second nature. It's like riding a bike. You won't be thinking about it after a while. You'll automatically just be able to pop a little air out, add a little dill,
Without thinking.
maybe
It's
adjust your
amazing.
BC a little. You're not even thinking about it, right? When you go down on a rebreather, your counterlungs are going to collapse. You're not going to have air for a second. And you're going to be like, oh my goodness, I can't breathe. It's okay. By the way, that's 3 seconds. Just add a little bit of dill. Remember one thing. No matter where you are in a dive, no matter what's going on with the rest of this course, with the rest of the emergency skills, you can always add diluent. We plan our dive such that whatever depth we're at, we have the right gas mixture, as Gus said, to always be able to add diluent, and just take it easy for a second. This will become second nature. Remember this statement. I promise you, you're going to come over the hill and you're not going to want to dive any other way again. And everybody's light bulb came on that I've ever taught, including Gus.
Right.
Now he's
Of course.
perfect and better than me in the water.
That's
That's what happens. It just give it time. You got to practice. You got to put in the work. But then
Absolutely.
the reward is huge.
Plus, if you want to continue to move up, like if you want to get to, let's say you're watching this class because you're going to become a CCR diver, then a CCR decompression diver, then a CCR normoxic diver. We have multiple levels, so you can enjoy this unit to the maximum of its abilities, 2.5 hours, 200 feet deep. If you're doing that, one of the prerequisites to move up is that you're fully comfortable at whatever level you're certified. The only way to do that is to go out and dive it. Make it your primary piece of equipment, dive it as much as possible. Even if you know that, I'm going to go diving with my son, I'm going to go diving with my wife, I'm going to go diving with my buddy who's going to be open circuit and they're only going to be able to do 40 minutes. Maybe I should just do open circuit. It's easier. No. Force yourself to use the rebreather because you will get to a point where you're like, I do not want to dive without the rebreather.
Yeah, I don't.
But there's only one way to get there.
There's only one way to get there.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't really even like to sleep without my rebreather. I don't know if that's pushing it to that particular rule more than I should, but just having it with me next to my pillow.
TMI. Next rule that we're going to talk about is something that divers are used to, and even tech divers are used to, which is a lot of these emergency skills that you're going to learn in this class, whether it is on this virtual class or with your instructor in person. People tend to do them and then they never practice anymore. Like, how many open water divers launch their SMB at depth? Like, just for no reason, right? What happens is they get certified. They did the SMB once. The instructor was like, yeah, good job. And then 3 years later, you're in Cozumel, you get lost from your group, and now you need to fire an SMB. Do I even have one? Where did I put it? Oh, this pocket. How do I do this again? You have to practice bailout options periodically. Not every week, not every time you go diving. Don't bail out every time. Enjoy the rebreather for the way it's supposed to be. Do a safe dive, come out, no bailing out. But every once in a while, assume that any mechanical or electrical part of your rebreather, including your computer, will fail, and practice what you would do if it did.
Totally. And I tell you what's really fun. Remember this. You're going to enjoy, after you're done with the class and you're certified, actually auditing your friend that's now taking a class, right? Because you get to see the skills again. And the more you see them and the more you practice them, they've just become so second nature. And you're not under that pressure where they're just watching you do these skills. But here's something we're going to teach. I don't want you to memorize how to do any of these emergency skills. Like, memorize the step by step by step. I want you to instead just a natural understanding of course, this is what I would have to do. For every single emergency skill, you're basically going to do the same thing. We're going to show you that. That's what's so remarkable. You're basically going to be doing the same thing over and over again for almost every single emergency skill. And when you really understand the unit and how it's working for you, you won't have to memorize anything. But practice them over and over again as much as you can. And it's a lot of fun to do it as well.
Yeah.
You get confidence in your dive buddy as well. Remember to take care of each other, right?
Right.
Dive with a dive buddy. We're not teaching you solo diving here.
Yeah, and as you get comfortable, mix and match. Sometimes the failures may not be rebreather based. Maybe you lost your mask and now you have to exit all the way to the surface without a mask. What happens if, and Mike Young taught me this, is like, what if you lost a fin, one fin, or both fins? How will you get out of here without fins? So practice those things, even if it's once a year. What you don't want to do is go 5 years without practicing any skills and then having to use it, because you have to accept that all the emergencies you're going to learn in this class will happen to you at some point. At some point, your rebreather will stop working. You don't know why. At some point, you will run out of dill and you don't know why. There was a leak on the first stage that you didn't catch. Whatever. Accept that these emergencies will work and know that we're safe. We're practicing them. We learn them, and you can bail out of any situation.
Well said.
Now, the final of the 10 safe rules or safety rules for CCR diving is: do not start a dive with a known issue.
Well, it's a very easy rule to follow. Guess what? Don't start a dive with any known failure. That's the end of the rule.
Yeah,
and what are the potential failures, right? That's what we're going to go through. You're going to do a pre-dive check with your rebreather. But for sure, you got to do that pre-dive check every time. And we even have little cards that you can have, that you can download, that tell you these little steps of a pre-dive check. For the most part, you're making sure that your gas is on, that your air is flowing in the right direction, that you are basically everything is functioning. Your ADV is working, your manual add valve is working, your gas is on, you have the right gases, you're aware of what gas you're using, your dive computer battery is good, your starting PO2, we typically start a dive at 0.7. All of that is set, all of that is working before you start the dive.
Right.
Anything that's not working on a rebreather, just don't do the dive.
Yeah.
It's just that simple. Or do it open circuit, because remember, you're wearing an open circuit kit anyway.
Yeah, and I've seen this before where people, will like open their O2 and it starts leaking, and they're like, wait, I hear a leak. It's fine. I'll be fine. And let's just go. Like, no, take your time. Close it. Find out what happened. There's an O-ring. Like, what's the problem? One that happened to me once, for example, it was frustrating. Luckily, it was a short dive, so we could abort and start in a few minutes, is I went to clip my bungee on the side, and it came undone. Like, it came undone from the hole. The knot came on, whatever. Like, I just pulled it, and it broke. If it was someone else, it would have been like, I'll be fine with just one. And then the rebreather would have been out of whack or whatever. Like, no, take it easy. Like, there's no rush. Let's fix the problem. Don't start your dive with a known issue. If one of your sensors is registering weird, right? Recalibrate. Like, take your time to fix it, figure it out. If you have a problem, switch to your spare sensor. Like, and this connects to don't be cheap. Like, there's no rush. There's no need to start a dive with a known issue, which then can be another issue underwater or a worse issue. And now you have to deal with all that, instead of starting on the right path.
Yeah. And I know we're saying a lot here, and you're wondering what all these different things to check are. And we're going to go through all of that. By the time you're done with this course, between the academics we're giving you here and the practical with your instructor, all of these things that we're saying you will do, and they don't take long.
Right.
I know at the beginning of a rebreather class, people say this, wow, how long is it just going to take me to do all this stuff that you guys are talking about? I'm not kidding you. This pre-dive check, like 3 minutes to make sure you don't have a known issue. It's not that complicated. It's not that hard. You're going to do them over and over again. So don't let this scare you. We're just saying don't skip it. And it becomes very second nature.
Yeah, and let's repeat the 10 rules really quick just as a summary, and you will see that the vast majority of these don't require any time. They're just in your mind, right? So number 1, avoid complacency. We talked about that. Number 2, avoid distractions. Number 3, be a disciplined diver. Stick to the plan. Number 4, be a thinking diver, okay? Number 5, always know your PO2, which should be rule number 1, but it's one of the 10. Number 6, don't be cheap. Number 7, make the CCR your primary diving equipment. Dive your rebreather. Number 8, practice bailout options periodically, right? And assume that any mechanical or electrical device will fail. Number 9, accept that all the emergencies taught during training will happen to you at some point. And last but not least, do not start your dive with a known issue. That's rule number 10. So there you go. 10 rules for safe CCR diving.
And I love you.